Today, I am going to talk about involving families in relapse prevention planning. If an alcohol and drug counselor were only going to have one family counseling session while the client was in treatment, it should be family relapse prevention planning. So if you can't see families for anything else, you should see them to at least do family relapse prevention planning. Research and evidence is very clear when the families are involved in a client's relapse prevention plan and they provide support and accountability for that plan, the client relapse rates are much lower. So the basic procedure for family relapse prevention planning is as follows. The client works with the counselors to develop a relapse prevention plan first, meaning that the plan should be done before you involve the family, or mostly done. Then you have a family session and the client reads his or her relapse prevention plan to the family. And then the family is invited to respond and discuss. They may actually provide some additional information that can be used to update the plan. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And then the last part of the family relapse prevention planning is turning to the family members and asking them what they can do to support the relapse prevention plan. Now, this means identifying specific actions or treatment goals that the family can participate in. So often when I do this with families, I turn around and I say, so family members, what can you do to support, the client's family relapse prevention plan? And they'll say things like, I support it. I think it's great. And that's where I need to help them understand, that's fantastic, but what can you do? What actions are you willing to take to support the relapse prevention process? So oftentimes, relapse prevention planning is done towards the end of treatment, and so this is also helping direct them to look after treatment is over, what can you as a family do to support this process? So a side note here, you may end up working at an agency who employs a licensed mental health clinician on site that generally does the family counseling. I know there are some agencies in San Diego that do that. All family counseling sessions, for the most part, are done by often a licensed marriage family therapist. Even if you end up working at an agency that has a licensed mental health clinician on site, when you're doing the family relapse prevention planning, in this specific instance, the alcohol and drug counselor should do that relapse prevention planning session with the family, even if a licensed mental health clinician is available, as the initial relapse prevention plan is going to be developed with the alcohol and drug counselor. And this is really your area of expertise in the area that you've got so much training on. So even in that instance, if there is a licensed mental health clinician on site, many supervisors that are at agencies in San Diego have gone through the City College program, so they'll already be familiar with this. But otherwise, by all means, I would encourage you to advocate for yourself and say, hey, we really need to do a family relapse prevention planning session, and I would like to do this session with the family. The licensed mental health clinician can certainly participate with you if that's appropriate, but it should be your lead. Okay. All right, so let's just talk about relapse prevention planning in general before we talk about family relapse prevention planning. You will, get lots of relapse prevention planning training in the AODS program. It is basically the main reason why we do treatment. So the entire overarching goal of substance use treatment is to prevent relapse back into using substances in a way that was causing so many problems previously. So there's some general principles here that I just want to review today. So the idea here is that relapse is conceptualized as a transitional process. That's a clinical phrase, meaning that it is a transition. There are a number of events and things that happen over time that lead to a return to using substances. So generally, when I teach this in person, we'll do a little brainstorming about what tends to happen before somebody starts relapsing. But it may look like this. The person gets out of treatment and they're on the pink cloud and everything's fantastic and yay, recovery. And then over time, maybe they stop going to sober support meetings, and then they stop talking to their sponsor. And then they start hanging out with an old friend who they used to use with. And then they lose their job because of the coronavirus. And then they go on a first date, you know, with somebody who's like, hey, you want to get high? And all of a sudden they're using again. And what we can do is see that there were a number of different things that happened before that person started smoking pot. So the transitional process could have been potentially arrested at any given point, meaning that we could have recognized that the person was moving towards relapse and done something different in order to stop the process. So that's really what we do in relapse prevention planning, is we identify all of the different triggers or the specific things that could lead a person back to using or back towards using, and we develop a plan for each of those triggers. So the first step when you're developing a relapse prevention plan is to identify, or not you identify, sorry, to help the client identify why they previously used substances or continue to use substances in spite of negative consequences. So you want to get very granular and specific with them. Like, what were the specific situations, the specific emotions or thoughts or interpersonal conflicts or lifestyle factors, et cetera, that would lead to you picking up? Almost always when we talk about triggers, we talk about people, places, and things. So you want to try and identify who were the people that you used to use with? Where were the places that you used to use? What were the things that were associated with substance use? So when you're working with the client, you're going to write down all of these triggers. So, you know, specific situations. You know, I used to use every afternoon when I came home from work. I would often get high when I was feeling anxious. Many times after I'd get off the phone with my mother, I would use. You know, on Friday night, I would go out with my friends and we would use. I'd go to see baseball games and I'd get loaded. You know, my brother always pressures me to get high with him when we get together. So we would be writing all these things down and come up with our list of triggers. So once we've identified the reasons why someone uses substances or identified the triggers, then the relapse prevention plan is developed to minimize the impact of these situations. So what we want to do is increase awareness of those high-risk situations before they're experienced. So many times when you ask a client, well, why do you use substances, especially if it's their first time in treatment, they're like, well, what do you mean? Like, well, why do you pick up? Like, what's happening that contributes to you picking up? And so the act of going through and identifying these triggers increases awareness. Many times clients will say things like, wow, I never really thought about it before, but yeah, I guess I do. I pick up every time I feel anxious. And so we're increasing awareness of those triggers before they're experienced. And then what we're doing is we're creating a specific plan to address those situations when they come up. And usually that's going to require doing something different than picking up substances, a different behavior or the use of a coping skill. So in a relapse prevention plan, each trigger should have a specific plan to address that trigger. So if I'm triggered to pick up when I feel anxiety, and I'm triggered to pick up when my brother pressures me to get high every time that he sees me, well, then there's two plans in there. I need to have a plan for the anxiety, like what am I going to do when I feel anxious so that I don't pick up? But I also need to have a plan for what am I going to do about my brother and every time that he comes over and he pressures me to get high. So each trigger has a specific plan to address that trigger. Now, when you're developing a plan, the plan usually falls into one of three categories. So the first one is avoiding. So you want to stay away from the trigger if at all possible. So if one of the triggers is that, you know, I used to go out and I would use substances with my friends in the park that was 2 blocks from my house. Well, then one way to deal with that plan, and every time I walk by the park, you know, I'm triggered to use. So the plan may be, well, don't walk by the park, right? Can we avoid the park if at all possible? Then we avoid the trigger. But sometimes we can't avoid it. So maybe my mom's house is off the park, right? Or she lives in the same street that the park is in. And, you know, I have to walk past the park in order to get to my mom's house. So a seeking alternative for the plan is, well, can you do something different when you're exposed to the trigger? So instead of walking past the park, getting triggered in order to see my mom, you know, then maybe what I do instead is I take the long way and I go around the block and I go to my mom's house so that I don't have to walk past the park. So I'm seeking an alternative. And then the third category is developing coping skills. So especially this, when you can't avoid the trigger or seek alternatives, then you need to find a way to manage that trigger in a way that lessens its impact on cravings, thoughts, and emotional responses. So let's say that my brother always pushing me to use with him is the trigger. So can I avoid my brother? Well, no, we're family. Our family's very close. They get together all the time. Okay, well, can you do something different, when he's trying to get you to use, like, I mean, can I do something different? Yeah, I need to not use. Well, how are you going to deal with that? How can you develop coping skills? Well, I think what I need to do is maybe tell my brother beforehand, hey, I'm in treatment, I'm in recovery, I'm not using right now, set a boundary, ask him, not to do that. And maybe what I'll do is I'll bring my girlfriend with me, who knows that I'm sober, so that I can cope better, so that even if he's pressuring me and she's standing there, I can use the strength of having her next to me or something like that. So when you're working with a client to develop the relapse prevention plan, then you're going to be engaging in dialogue with them on each of these. All right, so let's talk about this trigger. What do you think we can do to try and deal with that trigger? All right. So the essential idea here is that people often relapse when they're caught unprepared for a situation. So if I haven't really thought about the fact that I always get high with my brother, and I get out of treatment and I go to mom's house, and my brother unexpectedly is there, and he's like, dude, come on, come outside, meet me in the back. And we come out back and he busts out a joint. Well, I'm unprepared for that. I didn't figure out beforehand what am I gonna do? Whereas if I had already talked about this with my counselor, that, we role played, I practiced saying to my counselor, hey, brother, I need to let you know, man, that I'm trying to stay sober. I've made a commitment. Please don't ask me to use with you. So when I have an identified plan and then I unexpectedly run into my brother, I will tend to implement that plan without using. And so we know this works. When people have a plan, they will usually follow that plan. Sometimes the identified plan may require developing new coping skills to handle the situation. If I don't really know how to set boundaries with family members, I may need to practice setting boundaries so that I can implement that coping skill when I see my brother. But the other option is that when there is no plan for what to do when exposed to trigger, well, then people generally are going to do what they've always done when they're exposed to that trigger. In our case, they are probably going to use because that's what they've always done. So let's take a little side step into lapses and relapses. This often creates a lively conversation when I do this in person. And there's a little bit of controversy, especially amongst the old school people with this. So lapses versus relapses. So a lapse is considered a one-time or a short-term violation of an abstinence goal. A relapse is a return or a return to lapses or abandoning the abstinence goal. So let me give an example. So let's say that I've gotten out of treatment, doing good, talking to my sponsor almost daily, I'm going to meetings, I show up at my mom's house, my brother unexpectedly is there. He says, dude, come out back. He busts out a joint and he's like, here, and hands it to me, and I don't know what to do. And so what I do is and I take it from him and I take a hit and then realize, shit, what am I doing? I don't want to do this. And I hand it back to him and I'm like, dude, sorry, man, I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what I'm doing. I just got out of treatment. I'm really committed this time. I'm going to stay sober. I'm sorry, I can't do this. And I go back in the house. Well, if I call my sponsor and I'm like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened. I saw my brother, he handed me a joint. I smoked the joint. God, what am I going to do? I blew it, man. I just took a 90-day token. My sponsor's like, okay, it's great you called me. Look, I'm going to meet you. Let's go to a meeting right now. And my sponsor picks me up and my sponsor and I agree that I'm going to do 90 meetings in 90 days. And I've recommitted to my abstinence goal. Well, then that's considered a lapse, right? That was a one-time or a short-term violation of my abstinence goal. My goal was to stay sober. I fell off, got right back on, right, and continued on my path to stay sober. Whereas a relapse is abandoning the goal. So let's say that, my brother hands me that. I am like, oh, fuck it. Now that I'm smoking, like, yep, let's do it. I stop off at the bar on the way home, then I call the dealer, and then I go on like a 4-day bender, right? That would be a relapse. So in this case, I abandoned my abstinence goal. Now, that where this gets really, like, everybody gets really excited about, like, well, what if this and what if that and what if this? So what if I took 2 hits versus 1 hit? Is that still a lapse? Well, what if I smoked a whole joint, you know, and it wasn't until the next day I called my sponsor? Is that still a lapse? Don't worry about all that, right? Just understand the idea that a lapse is a short-term violation of the goal, but you immediately get back on track. Whereas a relapse is you are not trying any longer to maintain sobriety. So we know that lapses are super common. So research studies have indicated that somewhere between 50 and 85%, depending on the study, have shown that clients will use at least once when they attempt sobriety for the first time. So a first timer in treatment is pretty likely going to have a lapse. It's going to be very difficult never to use again. Now, if I told you that there is a 50 to 85% chance of rain today, well, then you'd probably plan for that, right? We'd bring an umbrella or a rain jacket or something along those lines. And so we need to understand that lapses are really super common. I'm not going to talk about it very much in this class, but you'll get it in some of the other classes. There's been some changes in the legislation in the state of California about how agencies should cover lapses and how you can incorporate lapses into a treatment plan. Again, we're not going to cover it here, but basically lapses happen. So the big thing is how the person perceives and responds to that lapse is going to strongly influence whether or not it becomes a relapse. So if I perceive taking a toke, you know, with my brother in the backyard as, oh my God, what am I doing? And I immediately call my sponsor. Well, obviously that is influencing me in a positive direction where it's not becoming a relapse. Whereas if I hadn't thought about this, I hadn't planned for this, if I wasn't really committed to my sobriety anyway, then that may lead into a full-blown relapse. So when you're doing a relapse prevention plan, relapse prevention plans can be used both to prevent a relapse, and in some cases you can include in a relapse prevention plan how somebody is going to respond to a lapse. So an example of that might be that in the relapse prevention plan, it says if my family thinks that I'm intoxicated, I agree to submit to a drug test. Now this is established long before any potential lapse happens so that there's an agreement of what's going to happen in that instance. Or you put in the relapse prevention plan, if I do end up using again, then I agree that I'm going to re-enter treatment. So these are ways to include addressing lapses in the relapse prevention plan. There needs to be a recognition here too that many times people who lapse may need more skill development or more support to manage high-risk triggers until they have the strength to handle this on their own. So I'll go back to my example again of my brother in the backyard. I might have talked to my counselor about setting a boundary and, you know, saying no, but then when it came to actually doing it, I didn't know how to do it. I froze. I was afraid. I hadn't practiced that enough. So in this case, I may need more development in my skill of setting boundaries. So the analogy here is that when somebody badly sprains their ankle and they put a temporary cast on it, then what they'll do is they'll remove that cast and then gradually increase, you know, putting pressure on that ankle as part of physical therapy until the ankle is strong and then the cast can be fully removed. And so that's the essential idea here in managing lapses as part of relapse prevention planning. So we do know that people who attribute the lapse to personal failure, factors beyond my control, like it's not my fault, you know, I didn't know my brother was going to do that, then it's more likely that I will abandon my abstinence goals. Whereas if people see a lapse as, oh my God, like I didn't know what to do in that situation, then they're more likely to learn from their mistake and re-engage in the abstinence goals or get back on the horse after you fall. All right, so then, you know, the question would be, so who generally does better in recovery after they leave treatment? The person who's isolated and they're doing this all on their own, or a person who has a team of supportive cheerleaders who will participate, encourage, support, and pick the person up after a lapse and help put them back on the horse? So the answer is, so the person who has a team of supportive cheerleaders. So that sort of leads to why you are taught about family relapse prevention planning. So involving families in relapse prevention planning, we know that the people who support, encourage, and participate in immediate family members and friends treatment are the most successful in maintaining sobriety and avoiding relapses after a lapse. So in family relapse prevention planning, we have some general goals. So again, the client will develop the relapse prevention plan first, then the family's called in. And so the first goal is to help the family learn about and understand why the family member uses substances or what their triggers are. This is why the client will read the relapse prevention plan to their family members so that the family members hears what those triggers are. We also need the family to learn and understand what the specific plans are to address those triggers without returning to substance use. And then we're going to identify how the family members can participate in and support the family members' relapse prevention plan. So, here, let's see. So let's say that one of the triggers is a particular friend of the client's, right? So Mary, I used to use with Mary. My family doesn't know that. My wife doesn't know I use with Mary, or my parents didn't know that I use with Mary. But then I read in my relapse prevention plan that Mary is one of the people I used to use with, and Mary's a trigger. So that's important, like for my family, like, oh, I had no idea, right? So now they know that, so that's going to help in terms of accountability. So my plan is that I'm not going to hang out with Mary. If Mary calls me, I'm going to say that it's not okay. Oh man, hold on just a second. Son of a bitch, my cat is killing an animal out there. Hold on. All right, I'm back. So sorry for the adventure there. I'm looking out my office window and my cat was in the process of catching a baby squirrel. So I saved the squirrel and now we can go back into our lesson. I have no idea where I left off. Family should learn about the triggers. Family learns about specific plans to address those triggers, and then we're going to ask the family to participate in the relapse prevention plan. All right. So note that oftentimes there are warning signs that the client may see in their own actions or other people may see that could indicate the person's moving towards a relapse. So before they pick up, maybe the person stops going to sober support meetings, they start hanging out with old friends, they increase isolation or secrecy, they're not following the established plan. So this is something that other people might observe. So my wife, my kids, my parents might see me doing these things and that we've identified as warning signs. So the people who see the warning signs are usually key stakeholders. So family members are definitely people that see the warning signs. Friends, sponsors, counselors may also see the warning signs as well. So in a family relapse prevention planning session, in addition to the goals being that the family learns about the triggers, learns about the plan, comes up with a way to participate, it may also be appropriate to encourage family members to identify warning signs that they saw in past substance use or relapse, and then developing an agreement or a plan that can be included in the relapse prevention plan for how the client or the family is expected to respond when they identify warning signs. So, the family might say, my wife might say, yeah, in the past, I always knew you were using because you started going out for long drives. You'd tell me you were going to run an errand and then you wouldn't come back, for an hour, and you'd tell me the store was really busy. And I'd be like, oh, wow, I didn't know you realized that. And so the counselor might then say like, okay, so, wife, wife Keith, how should we deal with this going forward? I mean, if Keith's going for long drives again, I think we should come up with an agreement of what should we do. So what do you think? How do you want your wife to handle this? Like, and I may say to her like, well, I mean, I won't do that, but I guess if I was doing that, then I'd like you to talk with me about it, right? Bring up the fact that it seems like a lot longer than I should have been gone. And so what you do is you discuss and have a dialogue there about what the warning signs are and what to do in the session. The relapse prevention plan itself, I'll show you one here at the end, but the relapse prevention plan itself is one of those living, breathing documents where you'll often update it and make revisions depending upon what you've been exposed to, and certainly after the family session, often relapse prevention plans are updated as well. All right. Some of the counseling techniques that you use in the family relapse prevention session, it's different, unlike the open family counseling session that I've trained you all. When you do an relapse prevention planning session, you have a very specific agenda. So instead of having the family come in, like, how can I be of assistance? How do you want to use our time? In this case, we need to let them know that we have an agenda. We're going to be reviewing the client's family relapse prevention plan. Initially, the family likely will need some education or at least an orientation to addiction and relapse prevention to help them understand the purpose of this session. What I always do when I'm working with a family doing family relapse prevention planning is I just ask them when they first come in. So has anybody ever done this before? Done a family relapse prevention planning session? And if they say like, oh yeah, we did this, last time Keith was in treatment. Oh, okay, great. Well, what was that like? What did they do? Well, we kind of talked about Keith's triggers and what he was going to do about that. Like, okay, got it. So I know they understand what's coming. But if they have no idea, they're like, yeah, no, we've never done this before. Then I'll probably just give them a little brief orientation. Okay, so let me tell you what's going to happen here today. So Keith's been working on identifying some of the things that often have led to him using before. He's going to read his relapse prevention plan, which is both those triggers and his plan for it. You'll have an opportunity then to give some feedback and discuss it. And then we'll talk about what you can do as a family to support this process. So when I say education and orientation, it can be kind of brief, right? But covers what's about to happen next. So after you've explained the purpose of the relapse prevention planning session, client reads the relapse prevention plan, you have a discussion about the plan, and then you ask the family what they're willing to do to help support the relapse prevention plan. So the first part is pretty standard. You and the client have already worked out the plan, and so it's just reading the plan, and then, okay, so family, like, now that you've heard the plan, let's talk about it. But the third part is where a lot of the work comes in. And this is really relevant to the things that I've trained you already about how to develop treatment goals. But here what you're doing is developing specific relapse prevention planning treatment goals. So we're going to ask the family what they're willing to do to help support that relapse prevention plan. Now, even though this session has an agenda, we're going to involve the family in the relapse prevention plan, it's still not your job to tell them what to do. So in other words, my client's not going to read the relapse prevention plan. We have a discussion, then I say, all right, family, so this is what you're going to do. You all are going to go to an Al-Anon meeting this week, and then you are going to talk with each other about that, right? That's bad treatment. People generally don't follow advice, and so we're going to use the same motivational interviewing and solution-focused therapy principles that we've learned already this semester. So what we're going to do instead is ask the family their thoughts about what they can do. Ask them what they're willing to do. Ask them what they've done in the past. Ask them if they have any thoughts about how to support this process versus me giving them lots of advice and telling them what to do based on my expertise. So we're going to use the same process that we've already learned. We're going to solicit ideas from them first. Now, if the family looks at each other and says, well, I don't have any idea, like, I don't know how to support a relapse prevention plan, don't buy that. They do have some ideas. It's your job to brainstorm with them. So, right? So I'm like, okay, well, let's just kind of brainstorm. Like, what do you think families do, other families do, to support somebody when they get out of treatment to prevent relapse? And you get them thinking, right, and coming up with their own ideas. And then after you've done this brainstorm, then you can bring forward some of your own ideas or thoughts as things that they might want to consider. So be a coach instead of a know-it-all, support their ideas, identify conflicts with those ideas. So, one thing, identifying conflict, maybe the 16-year-old daughter's included, and she says, well, Dad, you should get rid of all the alcohol in the house. Like, that would really help Mom stay sober, right? And the dad's like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, I don't have a drinking problem. Why do I have to get rid of it? And so when we have something like that, then you're going to be using your clinical skills to talk with them, identify conflicts, help the family figure out some solutions to this particular plan. And then we'll help them make those goals specific, measurable, and time-bound. So as an example here, now that you've heard the client's relapse prevention plan, I'm wondering if the family can identify specific things you all can do to help support the plan and prevent relapse. So we may ask them, what have you tried in the past that worked? Who do you know that's been successful at preventing relapse? What did that family do to support the prevention plan? What are some specific actions you're willing to do? Now, as part of bringing forward some additional thoughts after the brainstorm, much like when we've talked previously when working with families, that families don't usually bring forward education and support as a goal, we can bring it forward after they've developed some of their own ideas. Same thing here. So in family relapse prevention planning, there are some typical goals that the family engages in. So the first one is we want to help the family member who's in treatment or coming out of treatment avoid exposure to other people's alcohol and drug use. That's a major trigger when you are exposed to somebody else using or they're using in front of you. So we want to make sure the family understands cross addiction, which is the risk of developing a substance use disorder from exposure to addictive substances or activities. We want to support the family member in staying away from social situations where substance use is common. Maybe my brother, isn't participating in this family relapse prevention planning system, but, my mom and my sister definitely know that my brother's a problem. And so they set it up that what they're willing to do is always be in the room with me when I'm near my brother or something like that. Or we just agree that every time we go to grandma's house, there's all kinds of drinking going on. And so what we do is we avoid going to grandma's house. So what we'll do is find ways, hopefully, that the family can support staying away from substances. And then avoid having substances in the household, right, or using in front of somebody. So even if heroin is my spouse's drug of choice and alcohol isn't really her thing, it's probably good practice for me to avoid drinking in front of her or having alcohol in the house because of the danger of cross addiction. Typically, the person who is getting out of treatment needs to develop new habits and activities that are sober, that are still enjoyable. Part of a recovery process is recovering your life. So it's not just about a big downer of I'm not using, but it's finding things you can do that are fun that you can stay sober in. So families can definitely help other family members find and participate in sober recreational activities. But this works best when family and friends also participate in these alternative activities. So like the recovery games here in San Diego, which goes on over the course of a number of weeks, at least when there's not a coronavirus, are sober types of activities. There's a whole community here in San Diego. So maybe the family goes and participates in the recovery games with their family member who's just gotten out of treatment. And then usually the families themselves need both education and sober support. So part of family relapse prevention planning may be assisting them to develop a sober support network of other people or other families who support abstinence. They will almost always benefit from seeking education about addiction. And family members might be able to attend a sober support meeting with their family member that just got out of treatment and then have a discussion and share knowledge afterwards. This is usually a really great family activity for early recovery. Okay,